Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 288 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In what ways did the Atlantic world contribute to the American Revolution? When we try to better understand the international, inter-imperial, or even intercolonial dimensions of early America, we almost always investigate aspects of the Atlantic world. And that's because the 18th century Atlantic world was a diverse and well-connected place. In fact, it was a place made up of many places. The British Atlantic world, the French Atlantic world, the Dutch Atlantic world. The Atlantic world was also a place where the issues of empire, slavery, and constant warfare interacted with each other. Which brings us back to our question. In what ways did the Atlantic world and its issues contribute to the American Revolution? Tyson Reeder is an editor of the papers of James Madison and an affiliated assistant professor of history at the University of Virginia. Tyson is a scholar of the Atlantic world, and he specializes in the Luso-Atlantic or Portuguese Atlantic world. It's through the lens of the Portuguese Atlantic world that Tyson can help us better understand some of the economic and political factors that helped to foment the American Revolution. Now, during our investigation of the Luso-Atlantic, Tyson reveals details about the Luso-Atlantic and who traded within the Portuguese sphere of imperial influence, why so many British American traders turned to smuggling as a way to trade in the Portuguese Atlantic world, and how British American experiences with smuggling and trade in the Portuguese Atlantic led to the development and spread of ideas about free trade and republicanism. But first, did you know that you can buy gift subscriptions to the Ben Franklin's World subscription program for all your friends, family, and loved ones? It's true. We have a gift subscription option. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe, and just underneath the join button, you'll see a link that says Give as a Gift. Now, gift subscriptions are a great way to introduce your friends and family to early American history, or to help them keep up their love for the subject. Plus, gift subscriptions come with the same benefits as our regular subscriptions: ad-free episodes and a bonus episode on the last Friday of each month. As you think about the perfect gift for your friends, family, or loved ones, or perhaps even yourself this holiday season, please consider giving them a gift subscription to Ben Franklin's World. All right. Are you ready to investigate how smuggling in the Portuguese Atlantic world can help us see the development of some of the economic and political ideas that led to the American Revolution? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is an editor of the papers of James Madison, where he specializes in James Madison's tenure as Secretary of State. He's an affiliated assistant professor at the University of Virginia and a historian of the Atlantic world. He's also an expert on early United States foreign relations, and he's published a book on this topic, Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots: Free Trade in the Age of Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Tyson Reeder.
Thanks, Liz.
Okay. So when we talk about early America, we often end up talking about this place that historians call the Atlantic world. Tyson, as you're a scholar of the Atlantic world, would you tell us a bit about this world in the 18th century and about all the different aspects or elements that we need to understand so that we can understand this world?
Yeah, the 18th century Atlantic was a very diverse and yet very connected place. It was an era of empire in the 18th century. It was an era of slavery. It was an era of war, almost constant warfare, especially among European nations. It was an era of trade. And all of those aspects of the Atlantic world interacted. You might have wars fought over imperial territory, wars fought over the slave trade and the right to control the slave trade. Wars in Africa enhanced the slave trade as war captives of African nations are sold to European nations. Europeans exchanged slaves and other goods in Africa and the Americas. So the 18th century is a very turbulent time with a lot of trans-imperial or inter-imperial connections among Britain, Portugal, Spain, Angola, the MENA coast of Africa, Brazil, Spanish America, and British North America. Some of the major European actors were the British, Spanish, Portuguese, and French empires, along with some Danish and Dutch settlements scattered mostly in the Caribbean, although those nations did appear elsewhere in North and South America. But some of these major empires liked to think that they established territories and areas of influence. And indeed, they did have areas of influence, but they were never as large or as well controlled as European settlers and government officials liked to imagine. In British America, for example, Britons liked to think that they controlled territory west of the Mississippi after 1763, but that ignored the sustained presence of many Indian nations. In Africa, the Portuguese depended on powerful African merchant kings and their nations in the regions of Angola and the MENA coast, which is the area of modern-day Ghana. And territory frequently changed hands. In South America, the Portuguese and Spanish tussled over what was called the Banda Oriental, or what is now Uruguay. The Dutch and Brazilians warred over territory in Brazil during the 1600s. And what motivated the thirst for empire really depended on the time and place. Sometimes European officials sought to exploit agricultural products in the Americas. Other times they searched for gold. In the case of the Portuguese, they began to colonize Brazil after 1500, but they long dreamed of finding precious metals like their neighbors in Spanish Peru had done when they found silver in Potosi. But because the Portuguese didn't immediately find precious metals, Brazil long remained an afterthought for the Portuguese compared to their Asian and African possessions. That is, until 1695, when gold was discovered in the outer regions of São Paulo, in what is now the modern province of Minas Gerais, Brazil. And those gold discoveries started to revive the Portuguese Empire that had been waning since its heyday in the 1400s. So this is the Atlantic world we find ourselves in as the book opens.
You've certainly described a very turbulent, complicated world with lots of people interacting with each other. And it sounds like from your description, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like many of these people living in the Atlantic world and the different empires that are interacting there didn't always get along with each other.
There was, like I said, a lot of warfare, and yet there was a lot of interaction. Amid all of the strife, you have a lot of inter-imperial interaction. And so empires like to think of themselves as closed off spaces, that they controlled territory that other empires couldn't permeate. And yet subjects within those empires carried on thriving commercial networks with subjects of other empires. And generally those networks were, at least frequently, they were clandestine networks of smugglers and other forms of illicit interaction.
Now, in his book, Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, Tyson focuses on a specific aspect of the Atlantic world, the Luso-Atlantic world and its trade networks. Tyson, would you tell us about the Luso-Atlantic and what its trade networks look like?
Yeah, the Luso-Atlantic, you could also describe that as the Portuguese Atlantic. And so to answer this, let me tell you about the Marquis of Pombal, or just Pombal as he's known. Now, in Portugal, Pombal became King José I's principal minister in the mid-1700s, and that was his position in 1755. Now, on November 1st, 1755, a massive earthquake destroyed nearly a third of Lisbon and the surrounding areas, and secondary effects compounded this damage and suffering. So seismic waves swept people away into the Tagus River that borders Lisbon. Fires decimated the city because candles had toppled to the ground, flames had escaped their hearths, and wind picked up and intensified the conflagration, spreading the fire around the city. And so in this sort of Aristotelian nightmare, earth, fire, water, and air all combined against the inhabitants. Upward of about 15,000 people perished, and perhaps as many as 30,000. And so this is a major event in Europe, and writers are commenting on this, trying to figure out what this means. But amid this destruction, this terrible earthquake in Lisbon, Pombal seized the opportunity to revitalize the Portuguese economy by taking the reins of government from Dom José I, not in a rebellion, Jose was really shell-shocked and lacked the stamina to rebuild Portugal. He wasn't a very effective leader before the earthquake, and he certainly wasn't after the earthquake. So he let Pombal have pretty free latitude. And one of Pombal's goals was to divorce the Portuguese Empire from economic dependence on Great Britain. Portugal and Britain had signed a series of treaties since the mid-1600s that had really surrendered the Portuguese economy to the mightier British. So beginning in the 1750s, Pombal began to have success in making Portugal less dependent on British manufacturers. To make up for the loss, British traders turned to Asia and British America and started throwing their manufactures in greater abundance into those areas. So beginning in the 1750s, British Americans really increased their imports from Britain, spurred, at least in part, by Pombal weaning Portugal off of British goods. Now, how do British Americans pay for those increased imports? They pay for them by increasing their provisions that they sent to Portugal. When I say provisions, I mean things like wheat and flour, bread stuff, and other types of perishable food stuff. And Portugal had long been dependent on foreign sources for their bread stuff. So by weakening ties to Britain, Pombal inadvertently strengthened ties with British America. Now, traders in Portugal frequently returned wine or fruit to British America to pay for those imports, but they also frequently smuggled gold, Brazilian gold, to Great Britain. So they would import gold from Great Britain, and that gold was not legally, it was not supposed to leave Portugal, but it did, and it left it in droves. So they would smuggle gold to Great Britain to pay British Americans' creditors so that they could pay for the foodstuff that they were receiving from British America. So to receive higher supplies of gold from Brazil, the Portuguese Empire encouraged the slave trade between Africa and Brazil so that African slaves could mine gold in Brazil. So what seems like a fairly straightforward relationship where British Americans shipped provisions to Portugal and received wine in return, that trade relationship came with an entire complex network of gold smuggling and slave trading that enveloped Africa, South America, North America, and Europe.
There are so many directions we could go from here, and I guess we should begin with the management of this trade network, because it sounds like the governments of Great Britain and Portugal had ideas about how they might manage this trade network, and yet people on the ground, they weren't just shipping the goods they were supposed to ship along this trade network, but they were also shipping other goods like gold, as you mentioned. So Tyson, could you tell us about the management of this Luso-American trade network and how this network really operated on the ground?
Certainly. I think that it would be useful to describe the story of Thomas Rich. Rich was a trader in Philadelphia who, in the early 1760s, had begun to trade with the Portuguese Empire. And in 1763, he undertook an unsuccessful smuggling venture in Brazil. Now, his unfavorable experience revealed that imperial states wielded substantial power over the parameters of commerce, and yet at the same time, it exposed the potential of commercial networks, of these diffuse, informal, and frequently clandestine commercial networks to contravene imperial law. So in September of 1763, Rich reached out to William Street. William Street was a trader on the Portuguese Atlantic island of Faial. Faial is a small Portuguese-controlled wine-producing island in the middle of the Atlantic. And so Rich reaches out to Street, who lives in Faial, to cooperate in his scheme to smuggle in Brazil. Now, Rich had never corresponded with Street, but he learned of him through an intricate network of friends and family and business associates. A friend in New York had put William's brother, Francis, in contact with Rich. And like Rich, Francis resided in Philadelphia. So Francis informed Rich that his brother William again living in Fayal, Francis informed Rich that William could procure them a cargo to sail to Brazil. Now, the problem is that this is illegal for Thomas Rich. It would contravene both British and Portuguese trade laws by trading in Brazil. Now, William probably obtained a license from the Portuguese government that would have allowed him to send just one of the few vessels per year that the Portuguese government permitted to sail from Fayal to Brazil. Now, if that was the case, William would receive a legal return cargo from Brazil to Fayal, but Rich planned to divert his portion of the cargo from Fayal back to Philadelphia. So his actions, again, are contravening British and Portuguese regulations, exporting Brazilian goods to a foreign empire and importing foreign goods into the British Empire. But Rich agreed to move forward despite these imperial prohibitions. So Rich and William Street were brought together by a loose network of mutual business connections, and they collaborated in a trade that defied the authority of Atlantic empires. So Rich hoped to receive Brazilian hides, Brazilian sugar, and if possible, and especially Brazilian gold. Now, why smuggle in Brazil? Well, because the British government protected the sugar market of the British West Indies by prohibiting mainland British Americans from importing foreign sugar. They placed prohibitive duties on foreign sugar. But foreign sugar tended to run cheaper than British West Indies sugar. So to import foreign sugar was a big draw for British mainland Americans who wanted to get their sugar cheaper. And also, like I said, Brazilian gold was a big draw also. Now, toward the end of 1763, Rich loaded a ship with about 550 pounds worth of goods. He sent it across the Atlantic to William Street in Fayal. Street sold that cargo and then sent the vessel to Brazil to pick up a cargo in Brazil. Captain George Ronalds sailed with instructions. He was in charge of the vessel that Street and Rich were employing for this venture. And Ronalds sailed with instructions to hide any contraband goods to escape detection. Now, by the spring of 1765, remember, it's mid-1763 that they begin to discuss this venture. By the spring of 1765, Rich's contraband trade with Brazil really sputtered to a halt due to state restrictions on trade. Now, to ensure that Brazilian goods weren't routed to prohibited destinations, Portugal required vessels to sail out of Brazil as part of a larger fleet of vessels sailing. Now, because of this fleet system, Rich could receive illicit Brazilian goods most securely by routing them through Fayal with the rest of the fleet. Once at Fayal, he could have the goods transferred into wine barrels and smuggled into Philadelphia, disguised as a legal shipment, because the Portuguese and British government had a trade agreement that allowed direct trade between Fayal and British America. But that's a very tortuous route for a ship to take, and it exhausted Rich's patience as the ship sailed to Fayal, then to Brazil, probably waited for the departure of the Brazilian fleet, returned to Fayal, and then headed back to Philadelphia. So Rich's patience is really exhausted. Also, by mid-18th century, Portuguese authorities had increased their vigilance against smuggling, especially by the English, whom they correctly assumed carried on a prolific contraband trade in South America. So, in fact, just months before Ronalds arrived in Brazil, officials in Rio de Janeiro had seized cargoes of several English ships engaged in contraband trade. So captains who were smuggling there needed to move more cautiously. So by the end of the venture, Rich abandoned the hope of curing any of his financial woes with Brazilian gold or sugar. And so disappointed, he practically gave away, those are his words, gave away his remaining quarter share of his venture to Francis Street. He sold it at a loss to Francis Street. And then a short time later, when William Street asked him to cooperate in another illegal venture to Brazil, Rich declined. He complained that it took 12 months to complete the previous voyage. So without the consent of imperial states, Rich found it difficult to sustain lucrative direct trade with Brazil. So a year later, we find Rich waiting for the Rio de Janeiro fleet to take gold to Lisbon so that his trade partners in Lisbon can pay his creditors in London on his account for breadstuff that he had sent his Lisbon partners, which is really the epitome of British-American trade in the Luso-Atlantic. So smuggling with Brazil had really failed to help him diversify his trade networks. Direct trade with Brazil remained closed to him, and he stayed indebted to London and depended on Lisbon to remit his payments to merchants in the British metropolis. So empires did make life difficult for would-be smugglers, but Rich's smuggling venture did have serious ideological implications for Atlantic empires. To execute the venture, Rich cooperated with a variety of contacts from around the Atlantic. He nonchalantly defied imperial laws in favor of a free trade ideology. Remember, he He stopped smuggling not because he was worried that he was contravening any sort of imperial law, but he only stopped because he didn't find it lucrative enough at that point. So his illicit enterprise really highlights this negotiation that occurred frequently between states and private traders as they vied for control over Atlantic commerce.
Now, what about smuggling? Smuggling is a form of trade, and yet, as we've just heard, it sounds like smuggling could be a really complicated and perhaps dangerous sort of trade. I mean, if you get caught, you could lose everything. And yet, people smuggled. So, how did people within the Luso-Atlantic world of the 18th century understand smuggling? Or why did smugglers smuggle?
Right. So smuggling was essentially the process of evading taxes while trading goods between empires, or where a certain foreign commodity was prohibited altogether, it was the process of clandestinely importing that commodity. Now, a lot of smuggling in British America occurred between mainland America and the French Caribbean islands and Spanish Caribbean islands. So sugar in those islands, that foreign sugar had high duties placed on it. And so those duties were prohibitive. So Americans in mainland America had difficulty finding cheap sugar. And yet, if you could succeed in bringing sugar from the French West Indies, which tended to be cheaper than sugar from the British West Indies, then you could really turn a nice profit and you could avoid foreign duties. So they'd create all sorts of these complicated smuggling networks. Now, some of them did turn out more lucrative than others, and many British Americans did smuggle with abandon. Not all smuggling networks were as complicated as Brazil, but what we see in Thomas Rich's example is really a thirst to enter Brazil if they could. Now, English traders found it a little bit easier to enter Brazil and smuggle in Brazil than their British American fellow traders, largely because if you are based out of England or based out of Fayal, like William Street was, you may be contravening the prohibitions of one empire, but not necessarily both empires, the British and the Portuguese Empire, because merchants in England could import goods directly from other empires, unlike traders in British America. So what we see in Thomas Rich is British Americans who are really short on currency. This is a perennial problem in British America, that they want hard currency. They want specie as the most valuable trade commodity in the Atlantic, but they frequently run short of specie in British America. So Thomas Rich looks to Brazil to hopefully cure that. And in his instance, he fails. But what we begin to see is British Americans and then later early US traders start looking to Brazil as a possible, very lucrative trade partner.
So it sounds like for smugglers, the advantage of smuggling was that they could get goods that they wanted, but that their home country prohibited or charged more for, like sugar. And they avoided paying taxes on the goods that they imported and exported, so they could sell these goods at a high profit margin.
Right. Now, it's about goods and money. It does come with an intellectual defense of smuggling that is starting to develop in the 1700s. And this intellectual defense is based on the idea of free trade as a natural right. So the idea of free trade as a natural right had been developing since the early 1600s, that governments should not restrict trade between empires. And in fact, we begin to see this concept as early as 1609, when a Dutch jurist, Huig de Groot, his name is often Latinized as Hugo Grotius, suggests that the creator had made the oceans to connect people rather than divide people. And so it's against natural law to try to put up barriers that prohibit people from trading with each other. And those ideas begin to develop throughout the 1600s. By the 1700s, some intellectuals began to defend smuggling as obedience to this natural law, that if empires are disobeying natural law by making prohibitive trade restrictions, then smugglers are justified in violating statutory laws, imperial statutory laws, so that they can obey the natural law of free trade. So in Rich's correspondence, we see none of this. I mean, he's not interested about, the philosophical implications of his smuggling venture. He's, like you said, interested in saving money and not paying duties and getting the goods that he wants when he wants them. But this comes against a backdrop where people are talking seriously about the ideological implications of smuggling for empires.
So when we look at smuggling from a smuggler's point of view, we can see that goods, money, and free trade ideology played into the reasons of why smugglers smuggled. But what did smuggling look like from the imperial point of view? If you're a Portuguese or British official in charge of monitoring the 18th century Atlantic world, how do you view smuggling as a practice of trade?
Right. I mean, the fact that people are smuggling means that you don't have as much control over your empire as you'd like. Now, this can change depending on the time and place. And in some instances, the waters are muddied about what constitutes smuggling and what does not, because so many officials, central authorities would call them rogue officials, but many officials in the colonies in both Brazil and North America, in British mainland America, are complicit in smuggling ventures, whether they're doing the smuggling themselves, whether they're taking bribes to take a blind eye to smuggling. In many ways, we see customs officials who are supposed to be controlling contraband trade who are actually complicit in contraband trade. But if you have an imperial official who's cooperating in this, it muddies the waters about how illegal is this versus just how customary is it. And so you do have rampant smuggling that is certainly not imperially endorsed, but just depending on the time and place, some empires may not worry so much about clamping down on smuggling as at other times. And that's where we start to see problems develop that lead to the American Revolution, is when Great Britain decides that it's going to stop turning a blind eye and it's going to pressure officials in America to stop turning blind eyes to smuggling. And you start to see friction build between British American traders and the central government.
So where smugglers saw smuggling as an opportunity to earn more money or to bring foreign trade goods into their colonies or to even take a stand on free trade, it sounds like 18th century empires had a very different idea of smuggling, where they saw smuggling as an inability to closely control their empires and even less import duty revenue, because if people are smuggling, they weren't paying import duties. And if you don't have this revenue from import duties, then ultimately empires have less money to control their empires. So whereas smugglers viewed smuggling through the lens of opportunity, you see these empires viewing smuggling through the lens of imperial control.
Right. Now, one of the overarching theories that guided imperialism, I say one of them because it's certainly not the only one and it was always contested, but one of the overarching theories that guided imperialism was mercantilism. And historians are starting to debate just how prevalent mercantilism was as a political economic theory in the 18th century. But it was certainly a part of the debates on political economy in Great Britain and in Portugal. And the idea is that wealth is generated by exploiting the resources from land. So the more land you control, the richer your empire will be. And you don't want those resources to make their ways to other empires, because then you're enriching other empires rather than your own. This, like I say, though, it was always contested. I mean, from as early as the 1600s, even before the British Empire had developed into the behemoth that would come by the 18th century, you start to see politicians, traders, and intellectuals who are contesting the idea that trade should be bound within an empire. And so policy fluctuates throughout the 1600s and 1700s. But within the idea of mercantilism is that if you're trading with other empires, you're enriching those other empires, and that's bad for your own empire. And so those who are contesting that idea begin to say, we should be trading with other empires. And that's how we enrich our empire. That if we open trade up to both import goods from other empires and export goods to other empires, then it can be beneficial for everybody. And some of these intellectuals start to use South America to give examples of this, where they basically say, look, rather than be looking for silver or gold mines like in Brazil or in Peru, we should be looking to trade with the Portuguese and Spanish empires, and then we can get that gold if we can just open up trade with these empires. And so many officials in the British and Portuguese Empire adhered to the idea of mercantilism, but it was actually always a policy that tended to be in flux depending on who was in power. Whigs and Tories frequently disputed the implications of free trade and just how free trade should be. And like I say, this really, in terms of revolution and the American Revolution, this starts to come to a head when Great Britain starts to need money from British America and starts to clamp down on smuggling and take a firmer approach to clandestine trade in British America.
That's really interesting because if we think about mercantilism and view the 18th century world by mercantilism, then I think we can at least see part of the reason why there seemed to be so much conflict in the Atlantic world during the 18th century. Because if you have all of these different empires thinking that wealth is finite and that if they don't control wealth, then other empires will prosper at their expense, then we can see why there's a lot of conflict. But this also sounds like a very imperial point of view that people on the ground, people who were living in the American colonies and in the Caribbean islands, really seem to have preferred the idea of free trade versus mercantilism. It doesn't really seem like they viewed wealth as something that was finite.
Right, that's exactly right. And that's an important word to use, finite versus infinite. Is wealth finite or is it infinite? If you're a mercantilist, you think it's finite because it depends on resources that you can extract from the ground, whether that's gold, whether it's agricultural products or something else. But if you're a free trader, wealth can be infinite just depending on what you have that you want to trade with other empires and the resources that you have to trade. And it can be infinite because it's actually based on one's labor. And so if you labor to produce goods that others want, then you're producing goods for trade. And as you trade those, then you can build wealth rather than work with a finite amount of wealth.
Now, as we've been discussing, smuggling proved to be a problem for many European empires during the 18th century, but especially for Great Britain. Because after the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Great Britain found itself with a massive war debt and a greatly expanded global empire that it needed to govern. Tyson, would you tell us how the British attempted to pay off its war debt and govern what had become a massive global empire by cracking down on smuggling?
Yeah, like you mentioned, the British government needed money. By 1763, the 7 Years' War saddled the empire with an enormous national debt, and Parliament looked to America to help improve imperial finances. Officials in London argued that British Americans had benefited from the recent war that cleared their region of dangerous French troops and their Indian allies. Now, per capita, colonists paid the empire 1 shilling in taxes for every 26 shillings paid by subjects in England. So these were hardly onerous taxes. And the government worked with an annual budget of about £3 million, besides the amount spent on debt, £360,000 of which went to maintain military support in North America. So central authorities reasoned that colonists must contribute more to their own protection, so they fashioned new laws to raise revenue and restrict contraband. So they passed the Sugar Act in spring of 1764. Now, most of the time, when we talk about the American Revolution and the causes of the American Revolution, the Sugar Act fades into the background once we talk about the more hated, the more controversial Stamp Act of 1765. But for British American trade with the Portuguese Atlantic, the Sugar Act was and remained the more significant of the two. The act was supposed to discourage the smuggling of molasses from the French and Spanish West Indies, paradoxically because the British government would finally lower duties on foreign molasses. And they hoped that colonists would just decide to now import it legally and just pay the lower duty so that at least the government can make some money off of these foreign imports rather than losing it all with smuggling. The problem, though, is that the Sugar Act also increased duties on other goods. Most significantly, for our purposes, it removed the long-time exemption of Madeira and Fayal wine. that upset this bustling trade between those Portuguese islands and British America. Wines from Madeira and Fayal had been exempted from the Navigation Acts of the 1660s, and British Americans imported copious amounts, especially of Madeira wine, at times almost exclusively Madeira wine was the wine consumed in British America. So I think, though, that we can turn back to Thomas Rich to look at how some of this played out on the ground. Thomas Rich was not shy about recording correspondence about his illicit trade in his letter books, which makes him a good source to look to for some of these smuggling ventures. Now, he had planned to smuggle Lisbon wine into Philadelphia, and Fayal was key to his plan. So before 1764, Lisbon wine from Portugal, was taxed like other foreign wines. But as I mentioned, Fayal and Madeira wine were exempted from those prohibitive duties. But smugglers like Rich would ship Lisbon wine to Fayal, transfer the wine into new containers, and import it fraudulently as Fayal wine and avoid the heavy taxes. But the Sugar Act ruined Rich's plans by removing the exemption from Madeira and Fayal because he would now have to pay high taxes on his wine, whether it was Lisbon wine or Madeira or Fayal wine. So even if he tried to smuggle them in without declaring them, the Sugar Act also increased customs vigilance, and it put the enforcement against smuggling in the hands of the far-off Halifax Admiralty Court rather than in local jurisdictions. And so smuggling now is more difficult. So along with others, Rich pled with his suppliers in Lisbon, letter after letter, to please send wine before the Sugar Act took effect so he could send it illegally through Fayal and avoid the tax on Lisbon wine. With so many wine importers doing the same thing, they glutted the British American wine market and stunted trade with Madeira and Fayal, with these Portuguese islands of Madeira and Fayal for years, literally a few years after 1764. So the Stamp Act caused merchants problems too, as they were required to use stamps on their shipping papers. But let's move forward to the Townshend Acts. When the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, planned to impose the duties that were named after him, the Townshend duties, he had originally planned to allow direct trade between Portugal and the colonies, which had been nominally prohibited to that point. Now, everybody did it. Everybody traded with Portugal and smuggled Portuguese goods into British America, like I've just described, but they weren't supposed to. Now, under Townshend's proposal, the government would increase revenue on things like glass, lead, paint, and other items, and it would also allow direct imports from Portugal at modest duties, which would incentivize colonists to stop smuggling those goods. And the Crown could collect revenue on those goods as well. Now, Townshend's enemies in Parliament defeated Townshend's direct trade proposal, and that led British Americans to assume there was some sort of nefarious plot between British merchants in Portugal and London and British officials to enhance their own trade at the expense of British Americans. So at the same time that colonists began to protest the Townshend duties, the glut in Madeira wine had finally subsided, so colonists renewed demand for Madeira wine, but the duties were still in place from the Sugar Act, so they began to smuggle Madeira wine, something they really hadn't ever had to do before. The eminent Boston patriot and smuggler John Hancock most famously smuggled wine on his ship, Liberty, which was detained by customs officials and incited riots in Boston. So Madeira wine had once been a symbol of privilege, as their status as British subjects with advantageous trade agreements with other empires, but it had eroded into a symbol of British subjugation of British America.
Well, it sounds like the Sugar Act and Townshend duties caused a lot of problems on the ground for British Americans. And Les wonders, what role British attempts to curb and end smuggling in the Atlantic had in fomenting and starting the American Revolution? So Tyson, what does your research reveal about the relationship between smuggling and Great Britain's attempts to end it and the start of the American Revolution?
Yeah, so I think here it's important to reiterate that mercantilism was always contested in the British Empire in one form or another. And again, we can date this back to early 1600s with the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius. Now, revolutionary British Americans, I mean, these ideas were being bounced around throughout the Atlantic, and a lot of these ideas were coming from Scottish and French intellectuals. So revolutionary British Americans didn't come up with these concepts, but they utilized them to make their case for free trade. A great deal of the animosity that developed between Britain and the colonies was over the increased presence of British men of war, naval vessels that cracked down on smuggling. Before the Sugar Act of 1764, colonists may not have enjoyed free trade with the French, Portuguese, and the Spanish empires, but they could smuggle with abandon. When that ability was thwarted, beginning in the 1760s, merchant communities grew restless with the empire. I should emphasize that colonists did not all speak with one voice on issues of imperial political economy, but during the Revolution, they came to a consensus that Britain had overstepped its bounds.
When we talk about the American Revolution and we try to figure out what caused it, we do often look at economic causes. And we can see in our conversation today that Americans had this idea that they wanted free trade, an idea that stood in direct conflict with England's mercantilist views. So when we think about the causes of the American Revolution, this was one cause in Americans' fight for independence. Now, another aspect that we also talk about when we try to get at what caused the revolution are political ideas. How Americans desired self-government. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, we're going to take a look at how economic ideas intertwine with political ideas to foment the American Revolution. It seems so natural to think about the ways in which British Americans interacted with the Luso-Atlantic world. And yet, how many times do we actually think about British Americans trading with Portugal and its colonies? Still, looking at all the trade and smuggling British Americans did in the Portuguese Atlantic, and how that trade developed and fell apart at times, really does help us gain a clearer view of how ideas of free trade developed and spread. Now, on a different trade-related note, the holiday season is now upon us. In a few short weeks, we'll be celebrating Thanksgiving, and then we'll move into the December holiday season. During this period of thanks, celebration, and gift-giving, I wanted to call your attention to the fact that Ben Franklin's World has a shop where you can find podcast swag for everyone on your shopping list. At benfranklinsworld.com/shop, you'll find that we have more types of swag than ever before. T-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, tote bags, stickers, mugs, masks, and more. You can also feel good about any and all purchases you make at benfranklinsworld.com/shop, as each purchase you make helps generate some funds that support the production of this podcast, which means that your purchases will help the Omohundro Institute and I continue our work to help you explore the early American past through great historical scholarship. Plus, you'll also be helping to spread awareness of Ben Franklin's World by showing the world that you and your friends and family are Ben Franklin's World fans and listeners. So, as you hunt for the perfect gift for your friends, family, and loved ones, or perhaps even yourself this holiday season, check out benfranklinsworld.com/shop. That's benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Tyson, did you find anything in your research that can show us how the different aspects that started the American Revolution, say the political and the economic ones, became intertwined with each other?
Yeah, so during the Revolution, Americans drew on their Whig history. Whigs had traditionally been more open to free trade than Tories. So they draw on that history to develop a syllogism where they equate independence with republicanism, republicanism with free trade, and free trade with prosperity. Now, as Americans came to associate monarchy with tyranny, they associated tyrannical laws, such as trade restrictions, with monarchies. Well, what is the remedy to tyrannical monarchies? Republicanism. Again, this is in the concept of British Americans at the time. So republicanism is also the remedy to tyrannical trade laws. And republics respect natural rights, so the reasoning went. So if free trade is a natural right, a republic can protect it better than a monarchy. But free trade was not just a natural right, they argued. It was the surest way to economic prosperity. Some British Whigs had argued that rather than try to compete with the Spanish Empire by either conquering Spanish silver mines or looking for mines and resources of their own. Like I had mentioned earlier, Britons could enrich their empire by trading with the Spanish Empire. So British Americans draw on these ideas that had developed over the 18th century to say, not only is free trade more prosperous, but a republic can protect free trade better than a monarchy. And so independence should equal forming a republican government, which should equal protecting free trade, which will give us all prosperity.
Now, what did the American Revolution mean for the Portuguese-British trade networks that we've been discussing? We know that Portugal wanted to trade with the Americans to become less reliant on Great Britain, and we know that the Americans wanted to trade with Portugal and its colonies for things like sugar and hard currency. So, how did the revolution facilitate or hinder this trade?
The most immediate impact of the revolution was to diminish trade drastically between North America and Portugal. The Marquis of Pombal, who we mentioned, he wanted to remain neutral during the conflict, but he also didn't want to upset his allied partner, Great Britain. He also worried about the example the American Revolution would give British colonists, and he really wanted Britain's help in a dispute over the Banda Oriental with Spain. Remember, the Banda Oriental is that border region that's now modern-day Uruguay. So Pombal worried that Britain would not help him in South America when Britain had its own military worries in North America. So in a desire to resolve the situation in North America as quickly as possible, Pombal actually suggested to George III that British America just get its own parliament. It would be a parliament subservient to the central British parliament, but that would make everybody happy, and Britain could then give Portugal military aid in South America. But Britain, by that point, had no interest in acquiescing to American demands. So in 1776, in a show of goodwill to Britain, Pombal embargoed all imports from rebellious British colonies. And that cut trade between British America and Portugal, except for some smugglers and rogue traders who continued to trade clandestinely with some difficulty with Portugal. Now, after independence, Americans hoped to revive their trade with Portugal. It had been an incredibly important trade partner as a consumer of their wheat and flour, and today it may be difficult to imagine Portugal's importance to early America, but it was a very important commercial destination in the 18th century, and Americans wanted to revive their networks there. But Portugal had no interest in restarting a relationship that made them dependent once again on foreign food sources. So they refused to sign a commercial treaty with the United States that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had tried to convince them to sign. And so that reinforced Americans' ideas that European monarchies and free trade absolutely ran counter to each other. By this point, also, Brazil was really becoming the most important commercial entity of the Portuguese Empire. So Americans start to hope for an independent republican Brazil that will be a lucrative trade partner. They want free trade with Brazil, and they assume they can achieve it either by smuggling or Republican revolution. And beginning in the 1780s, both methods seemed feasible. So in 1786, this is 3 years before the French Revolution, a small contingent of Brazilians appealed to Thomas Jefferson for U.S. support in their quest for independence. In November, while Jefferson was in Paris, he received a letter from a Brazilian who wrote under the pseudonym of Vendek, and this stranger revealed that he and his fellow Brazilians wanted to follow the example, that's his word, the example that Americans had given them, and declare independence from Portugal. So he requested support from the United States. Now, intrigued, Jefferson arranged a secret meeting with this mysterious correspondent at Nîmes. Jefferson was taking a tour through southern France, and he actually was intrigued enough that he went significantly out of his way to go to Nîmes to have this secret meeting. Now, once Jefferson arrived, he met José Joaquim Maia Barbalho. During his meeting with Jefferson, Maia Barbalho tried to state the case for a successful revolution in Brazil. He suggested the Portuguese troops in Brazil would do little to counter a revolution. He thought that slaves would throw their lots in with their masters, which was really just optimism bordering on fantasy. But he also assumed that revolutionaries would fund their revolution with gold from Brazilian mines, but they needed cannons, ammunition, and ships and military personnel from the United States. So basically everything that France had given the United States during the U.S. Revolution. And Jefferson explained that although the United States did not have the means or really the desire to meddle in a civil war, and he hoped to cultivate good relations with Portugal. He said something to the effect of a successful revolution in Brazil could not be uninteresting to us. So it's a kind of a pretty classic non-answer from Jefferson. And he refused to jeopardize relations with Portugal over this inchoate plot hatched by a small cohort of revolutionaries. But he did leave the meeting intrigued by the possibility of a Brazilian revolution. And he continued to mull this possibility over for the next several years, even into his tenure as Secretary of State, when the very first line of correspondence that he sent to the U.S. ambassador in Portugal was to request secretly information about the possibility of Brazilian independence. So we know this stayed on Jefferson's mind as he thought that Brazil could very possibly revolutionize. So for him, Brazilian conspirators represented the promise that the Americas would follow the United States into this prosperous era of free trade and republicanism. And think about the date. It's 1786. So again, this is a few years before the French Revolution. So Jefferson's first experience imagining a Republican revolution, one that sprung from the American Revolution, was in Brazil, not France. So Jefferson is carrying these ideas forward. And through Jefferson, we can kind of begin to see Americans anticipate a Republican free trade partner in Brazil.
And what happened with this idea? Were Americans ever able to see their wish of an independent Brazil fulfilled?
Well, this gets really messy really quickly. Now, there is a planned revolution in the 1780s. So in 1788, a small cadre of ringleaders in Brazil plotted to rebel against Portugal and to establish Minas Gerais, which was the major gold-producing region of Brazil, as an independent republic. There was a lieutenant called Tiradentes who planned to assassinate and decapitate the governor. Another lieutenant colonel in the army agreed to command his troops to stand down amid this tumult. And then Tiradentes would raise the bloodied head of the decapitated governor and demand the liberty of the people, at which point they assumed a riot would ensue and revolution would occur. Now, like many grand plans, they were thwarted by internal treachery. One of the group denounced the plot and his co-conspirators. The Portuguese government arrested the plotters, they tried them and sentenced them to death. But during the trials, though, only one of the conspirators, Tiradentes, was the only one who actually ended up being hanged and quartered by the government, incidentally. But at the trials of the Minas conspirators, imperial officials worried that the U.S. example had a deleterious effect on the loyalty of Brazilian subjects. They learned that defendants had drawn inspiration from the American Revolution and that they had closely studied American state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation. Some merchants in Rio de Janeiro got involved with the hope that revolution would introduce freedom of commerce and, in their words, make an English America in Brazil. English America was the term that they used for the United States frequently. So the testimonies revealed to Portuguese authorities a worrisome association of Republican revolution with independence and free trade, and that association appeared to emanate from the United States. Now, as a result, Lisbon officials began to make greater concessions to discontented Brazilians during the 1790s. They adopted a strategy that would appease the Brazilian population, but also leave intact the basic commercial relationship between Portugal and the colony. So first, they loosened some of the strictures on intra-imperial trade, meaning trade within the empire. But they also liberalized, to a certain degree, inter-imperial trade with Spanish America. But second, officials also strove to rein in foreign contraband to boost revenue. And so this dual approach of liberalizing trade and yet cracking down on contraband, it protected the imperial commercial nexus at the same time that it responded to some of the demands of Brazilians. And all of this allowed the Portuguese government to dissociate liberalized trade from Republican revolutions. And so in Brazil, we start to see a divergence between Brazilians and Americans in how they imagine the relationship between free trade and monarchy. In North America, monarchy runs counter to free trade. In Brazil, there's an assumption that monarchy can liberalize free trade. All of this starts to come to a head when the Portuguese court is forced out of Lisbon by Napoleon in 1808. and opens its Brazilian borders to foreign commerce for the first time. This only reinforces in Brazilians' minds the idea that the monarchy can liberalize free trade and you don't need a republican revolution. And in fact, they call the Prince Regent who did this, Dom João, they start to call him the liberator of commerce. And so we start to see these divergent national narratives in the early United States and Brazil about what free trade means for political systems in the Americas.
Tyson, why do you think it's really important for us to expand our view of early American history and the early American past to include histories of Brazil and Portugal? Why do you think we need a bigger lens with which to view early American history?
I think you can tell a lot about a nation's ideals and practices by how it chooses to view other nations as a reflection of that nation. In the case of early America and Brazil, early Americans wanted to believe that Brazil would reflect the political and economic values of the United States because they thought first it would be economically advantageous for them, but also because they craved validation for their republican experiment. And what we see in early Brazilian-US relations is the gradual demise of a vision of the Americas as sister republics. And the vision that replaces that, this is after the War of 1812, is a racialized vision of American revolutions, with the United States envisioned by, again, these are North Americans who are doing the envisioning. They like to think of the United States as a white, orderly, successful revolution, and South American nations as mixed race, unwieldy, unstable revolutions. Unlike Spanish American revolutionaries, Brazil retained a monarchy even after it declared independence from Portugal in 1822. For a lot of reasons we don't have time to discuss, it was actually the king's son, Dom Pedro I, who declares Brazilian independence from Portugal and assumes the kingship in Brazil. So many white Americans thought of Brazil. When they think of Brazil, they came to think of a monarchy stable enough to keep colored populations in check, to keep them from causing havoc in the hemisphere. And Americans came to assume that they should wield hegemonic influence or dominant influence in the Western Hemisphere. So it's no accident that toward the end of the Age of Revolution, the Monroe administration declares the United States essentially as the protector of the Western Hemisphere from European intervention.
Now we should jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if free trade had spread Republican ideas around South America as smoothly and as swiftly as early Americans had hoped for? How might the geopolitics of South America be different today if early American republicanism had caught on during the early 19th century?
I think a good way to think about that question is what may have happened if the Portuguese monarchy had not crossed the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro in 1808, because that move really culminated the idea for many Brazilians that a monarchy could institute free trade as well or better than republicanism could. And we kind of have a test case for what that might have looked like if the court had not moved to Rio, because we can see what happened in the Spanish Empire. To simplify a complicated story, Napoleon deposed the Spanish king and placed his own brother on the Spanish throne. That left Spanish America in a bind. Do they remain faithful to the deposed king? Do they give loyalty to the new king? Do they give loyalty to the Spanish Cortes, which were the ruling body that led the resistance against Napoleon? Do they assume autonomy for themselves? And so with a diversity of opinions, Spanish America began to separate into small autonomous regions: Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Argentina. But because in Brazil, there was a central monarchical figure in Dom Pedro to declare independence, Brazil remained a unified nation. It experienced some local autonomous revolutionary tumult along the way, to be sure, but never to the extent of Spanish America. So it's conceivable that had the crown never crossed the Atlantic when Napoleon invaded Portugal, we would have a nation of Pernambuco, where northeastern Brazil is today, or perhaps a nation of Bahia, or Rio de Janeiro, or Minas Gerais. So Brazil looks very different than it might have had the crown never crossed the Atlantic.
Now, Tyson, what aspect of the Atlantic world and its history are you researching now?
I am currently writing a history of foreign meddling in early America.
And where is the best place to contact you and to find more information about you and your work?
Yeah, you can find me on the history website of the University of Virginia, on the history faculty page at the University of Virginia. My email is there.
Tyson Reeder, thank you for helping us investigate the Atlantic world and for helping us to connect the histories of Portugal and Brazil to the histories of British North America and the early United States.
Thank you, Liz.
When we widen our gaze of early American history to include the people and places early Americans interacted with, we can see how differing ideas about government and free trade developed and led to big events like the American Revolution. As Tyson revealed, trade between Portugal and British North America began because Portugal wanted to become less reliant on Great Britain for foodstuffs and textiles. So Portugal and its colonies began trading fruit, wine, and gold to British North Americans in exchange for wheat, flour, and other foodstuffs. This trade with Portugal became a very important trade for British Americans. So when Great Britain started to impose duties on Fayal and Madeira wines and crack down on more informal and illegal trades like smuggling, British Americans grew unhappy. Americans began to argue that Great Britain violated their God-given natural rights to free trade by imposing duties and limiting the avenues of trade. Americans contended that Great Britain's monarchical government was tyrannical because it was prohibiting free trade. From there, it was just a short leap for Americans to wonder what kind of government might be better able to protect and promote free trade and their natural right to it. This is one way that British American ideas about economy and politics became intertwined and helped to encourage thoughts of revolution and independence. So in what ways did the Atlantic world contribute to the American Revolution? In this case, we can see how British Americans' desire to trade with anyone and everyone they wanted, for whatever goods they wanted to trade for, contributed to Americans' ideas that free trade was a good and natural right that needed to be protected by a republican form of government. Ideas that continued to factor into the ways that early Americans saw and interacted with the world once they achieved their independent republican government. You'll find more information about Tyson, his book, Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/288. Don't forget that you can give the gift of Ben Franklin's World this holiday season by purchasing a gift subscription for your friends, family, and loved ones. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe and click the Give as a Gift option. That's benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, Karen Wolf, and Peyton Young. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, do you think we can see British Americans arguing for free trade in other situations? I'd love to know what you think, so please let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.